All right. It's time again for another episode of Drummer Nation Live, the show where we talk about drums, drumming, and drummers with some of the best in the business, and today is no exception. Adam Nussbaum is my co-host, but he's out on the road doing what he does, and I have the great publisher and drummer and collector Steve Bryant with me to help with the interview, and also our guest is the great Gary Gauger, known for his rims. And without any further ado, let's bring him in. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Hi, Michael. Hi, Steve.
Good afternoon, guys.
In way of introducing Gary, let me tell you this little story on him. When I first met him, the first thing I said to him was, "So what got you interested in resonance and isolation mounts for percussion?" And he said, "Well, I was building a helicopter in my backyard." So that's the kind of guy he is. And I wanted to say, well, gee, why didn't I think of that when I was building the, space shuttle in my backyard? But the reason is mine was made out of Legos. So a little different. Gary, how are you, brother?
I'm doing good. It's warming up here in Minnesota, so it's getting better.
So I got to think you're a drummer from the get-go, right?
Yes. I should just give you a fast background. I had a teaching degree in elementary band musical instruments. I'm an elementary band teacher, and it's not something I had really wanted to pursue. But at the time the Vietnam War was on, every slot in the services was filled, and there were some great players. Steve Gadd was in the Army band when I was in the Airmen of Note. So, but I was teaching school and taught for about 3 months in Valley Forge area schools. And I just thought, this is not really what I want to do. And I had gotten to know Stan Kenton and had an offer to go with the band on a European tour. And I said, I can't do it. I've got to take a teaching position or I will be drafted. And I said, I'd like to get in one of the service bands. And he said, if you find an opening, contact me. And about 7 months later, I had a chance. There was an opening in the Airmen of Note, the Air Force band, and I contacted Stan, and he sent me a very nice letter and got me the audition, and I got in the band. And that's basically where I started as for a professional career, and that was in 1967 for 4 years. Steve got in, Steve was in for 3 years, I believe, so.
Well, let me stop you there, because I didn't know you were in the Airmen of Note. To people who don't know, that's the top-notch Air Force big band that was actually started by Glenn Miller.
That's right. And they couldn't use the Miller name, so they just called him the Airmen of Note, and they continued it after they did the Glenn Miller story.
And it's still a great band. I had a roommate when I was in college who left to go take a gig on that band, and he did it for like 20 years. And then the Stan Kenton thing, man, that's right up my alley. I grew up on Stan's music and got to know him a little bit, and he always loved to help young players out. So I'm not surprised to hear that story.
Yeah, when I was in college, Ernie Watts was in our band. We had a really good jazz band. I went to a little school called Westchester State College outside of Philadelphia, and Bob Curnow was a wonderful trombone player, and he had Sierra Music Publishing now. And he went with was writing for the Kenton band, and also he was rehearsing. And I went down. I guess they were in Philly, and I cut classes one day and went down and rehearsed for the band, which was wonderful. It's when he still had the mellophoniums going, and Dee Barton was conducting. Dee Barton was the drummer,
right?
But he was also writing for the band, and he was basically a trombone player, right?
Too, yeah.
And he basically said, if somebody wants to, said to Bob, if your friend wants to come down and play, I'm going to just rehearse the band. So I went down for a whole afternoon, and that's when I got to know some of the guys in the band and how that whole thing occurred. But I got in the Airmen of Note basically to get my service in, and it was one hell of a band. So it was probably the best opening that you could get into.
Beautiful, man. Now, also, were you a scientist as well back then? How did you bridge those? Where did that come in?
The thing is, I noticed a problem when I got my first drum set. I was 16, and I only had a bass drum and a snare drum. And I had an excellent teacher, a guy named William J. Shinstein, And you know how they say this guy wrote the book on well, Bill Shinstein wrote some of the most difficult percussion books. He had his master's degree from Eastman School of Music, which at that time was the number one school for percussion back in the 40s and 50s. And I remember I knew how to tune a drum, and I'd tune this tom, put it back on the thing, and it would just go thunk. And I thought, well, why does that do that? So I sort of tried to fix it, couldn't fix it. But then when I got in the Airman a Note, I was only in there for about a month, and we started doing a lot of recording. First thing we did, and this was sort of weird because I went from being a music school teacher to like 8 weeks later, we're doing an album with Nancy Wilson. We're doing recordings with Joe Williams, and then we did some with Shelly Manne. And Shelly had done an album called Man That's Gershwin, and a guy totally unknown had done the arrangements. His name was Johnny Williams, which is known as John Williams now. And I remember when we played at the Manhole, and I got talking to Shelly, and when we did a concert with him a few days later, he had a set of leady drums, and they were all calf heads, and they sounded great. And I said, we got talking about drum sounds, and he said, you seem to have a lot of interest in this. I said, yeah, I do. And he said, why don't you come down to the Manhole tomorrow night? Are you going to be in town yet? I said, yeah, we're here till Sunday. So he said, come on down to the Manhole. So we went down there and went back in the back, and I must have sat and talked to him for 2.5 or 3 hours, and it was fascinating. And the first thing he said, I've been trying to get these drum companies I was with to make changes on these drums because they got too much hardware on them. And he said they just choke, and they don't sound the way they should. They can sound better. And he said it's too bad because he said I'm really all about sound because I use this particular set in all the recordings I do with Mancini or whoever. And he was probably one of the most recorded drummers in the world at that time. So he sort of got me into it. And then when I worked up in Toronto for a while, and if you know anything about how the concert percussionists work, they're all about sound, and they had suspended bass drums a long time ago. And I remember some of the sounds that they would get out of the instruments and things like that, the timpanists and things. They were real sticklers for sound. So that was sort of the inspiration for a lot of it. And then I started working, when I started doing a lot of recording work, I wanted to get that sound that I had heard when you hold the drum up versus when you put the drum holder on a mount that's fastened to the shell. So that's basically what got me into it.
Beautiful, man. And Steve, you jump in anytime you want, man. I
Well,
can
it
ask
was,
questions all day.
I'm interested in how, from a business perspective, how this came together and what sort of reaction you got from artists as you began, sharing this technology with them, and what sort of response you got from the folks who, in the distribution channels around, getting these out into the marketplace.
Well, when I developed it, I bought a set, a Gretsch set, one of the last sets out of the factory, because when I was in the service, a drummer by the name of Jim Nelson, who was the original drummer with the Brecker Brothers when they were in college, and he called me one day. He says, "You've got to hear this drum set." And I went over to his house, and he had them hanging from rubber tubing. And it was a Gretsch set. He says, by the way, Gretsch has been sold. They're going to close the factory, but you got to hear these drums. So he had surgical tubing holding them in the weirdest ways, but when he hit them, they sounded unbelievable. So I immediately ordered a set because I thought it was one of the best sounds I had heard. And I've used that same set ever since then. And when I was working at a studio here in Minneapolis, it's called Sound 80. I basically moved here to work at the studio. And they did Funky Town there, and it was a small studio. But I remember I took the drums in to do a session. We were doing a lot of stuff for public radio. And the engineer there that owned the studio I'm behind the baffles, and I got a 10, 12, and a 14. And he says, he's in the record. He says, hit your 10. So I hit the 10. He says, no, no, hit your 10. I said, that is the 10. No, that's your 12. I said, no, that's my 10. Hit your 12. And I said, okay, hit the 12. No, that's your floor tom. I said, I said, no. And he said, wait a minute. So he comes out of the studio and he looks behind. Now, I had only had him for about 2 weeks. He looks behind there and he says, what are those things? I said, it's just a holder that I made up to get the pressure off the shell. He says, I've never heard drums like that. He said, every drum set I've ever recorded, I'm always adding bottom. He says, you got so much bottom on this, I got to roll it off. He says, this is amazing. So he said, can you leave that set here? I said, yeah, okay. I was playing a theater somewhere and I had another set that I was using to do the show. So every time I go to get him, hey, can you leave him? There's the producer for Roger Nelson is going to be in tonight. They want to use your drums for that. And I said, who's Roger Nelson? And the other guy says, we're not supposed to call him Roger. And I said, well, what do you call him? He says, he wants to be called Prince. Now, this is 1977, 76. And I said, Prince Charles? I mean, I didn't know what his name was. And he said, well, yeah, can they use your drums for that? I said, oh, sure, okay. Came in the next day and there's dents in there's holes in it. And I said, by the way, who is the drummer for this gentleman, Prince? He said, well, he plays everything. He's playing everything on these demos. And I said, well, he's probably not a drummer because I said it just destroyed the heads. So Tom Jones says, go down and get some heads at Dahlgren Thompson Drum Shop. Whatever you need to do, put them on there. Well, other drummers started using them, and I started getting calls. And my wife would say, by the way, there's a drummer from Chicago. Can you call him back? Okay. Yeah. Can you make me some of those things that you got on your drum? So I started getting drummers calling me about making these. And I was making them in my garage using a welding torch, getting sick from the fumes, hand bending them. And finally I thought, I got to find somebody that can do this because I just don't have the time to do this. And then as it went on, and I began to change the material on them and get them chrome plated, I finally realized I was going to have to get somebody to take it over. Went to Slingerland, nothing. And here's a phrase that I got so tired of hearing with the drum companies. The guy that was running it then, I met with him and he said, now, what is this thing you have? I said, well, it's this. And I have the bracket. And he said, now, that apparently goes on our drums, right? I said, yes. Put it on the drum. He says, now, what's this going to do? I said to him, have you ever noticed that when you take your drum off the holder and you hit it and you put it back on? He says, okay, I got to stop you right there. He says, I'm not a drummer. I have my master's degree in clarinet performance. I look over at his table at his desk and it says his name and it says President Slingerland Drum Company. Now he says, we got to get Bob in here. And he calls out to the shop and he says, have Bob come in here. Now the guy's name, I think Bob Hartline or Bob Hartman. I don't totally remember. But he comes in, introduces himself, and he says, I've been, Bud hired me back in 56 or something. He says, I've been with Slinger, and I'm the oldest guy here. Now, what do you got here? I said, well, this is a device that holds the drum and suspends it. Okay, I can see that. Well, what's it do? I says, well, it opens the drum up. And he says, well, what do you mean it opens it up? I says, well, have you ever noticed that when you take the drum off the holder and you put it on? And he stops me. He says, okay, I got to stop you right there. He said, Gary, I don't know anything about music. I don't even own a record player. I just design them. Now, I had meetings with Tai a couple of times. I've had meetings with Mapex. The problem is when you start to talk to these people, they'll stop you and say, I don't know anything about drums. I just run the company. So it started to get to be to a point where unless you're talking to a drummer, they're not going to understand what you're doing. And I noticed you did an interview with Bill Goodwin when I went to your site. Bill Goodwin was here at the house one day because he was playing with Phil Woods, and I knew the guys in the band. So when they were in town, they'd come over to the house, and I showed it to Bill, and Bill says, "What are you going to do with this?" I said, "Bill, I have no idea." I says, "I got a patent on this thing." I said, "I can't even give it away." I said, and guys are calling me for those, and I said, "I've taken it to the drum companies. They don't know what it is. They don't know why they would put something that costs more money on their drums." And I said, he said, "You know what? You need to call Russ Kunkel." And I said, "I don't know Russ Kunkel." He says, "Well, here's his number. Give him a call. He loved this." And I remember calling him. Unfortunately, I think I got him out of bed. And I tried to explain it to him. He says, "Can you send me a picture of it?" So I sent him a picture. He called me immediately about 4 days later and said, "This is one of the best things I've ever seen." Now, he didn't even hear it. He just saw it. And he knew right away what it was going to do for the drum. So I made a set for him. And then I probably made 4 or 5 more sets for him for all his sets. And at that time, he was traveling around with James Taylor. He was doing Linda Ronstadt. He was doing Joe Walsh. I mean, he was the player out there. He told Jim Keltner about them. Keltner told Porcaro about them. And for about 2 years, I remember Remo said to me one time, "I see your rims all over the place in LA. I don't see them any other place." I said, the stores really don't want them. They really don't want to carry them. And they felt that if they carried them, it would be detrimental to their distributorships for the drums that they carried. Because one guy said, "If I sell a drum set at Christmas time to some parents or somebody, and then I say to them, now, if you really want them to sound good, put these things on that this guy makes in his garage up in Minneapolis." So they right away knew there was going to be a conflict, and it was unfortunate. But it wasn't until Jeff Porcaro started really talking them up that the companies were actually the stores were actually forced to get them. But everything that I first sold for about the first 2 years was going through Pro Drum in LA. And if you think about it, pro professional drummers, they didn't care what they were playing. Most of the time they're using rental sets, but they'll like old Gretsch sets. Like Jeff Porcaro used to like old round badge Gretsch sets, and I talked to him about it several times. And they were all about sound because they're doing recordings, so they weren't so much about the cosmetics. So,
Well, a couple of things hit me right away from what you said. I had a business and sold it and did okay with it. Steve's had some businesses, but I get people who come to me and they have an idea. "Hey, Michael, look what I have.
yeah,
It's a little thing that goes on the snare drum. It'll hold your stick," or something like that. And I have
right,
another friend who invented something and he licensed it to somebody, and they were producing it. And so, "How you doing with that?" "Well, I'm making 5, 10,000 a year." I said, "Well, what's wrong with that? Maybe it's not. You're not going to get rich on any of these kind of products. You know what I mean?" Of course, you know what I
yeah,
mean. And
yeah,
the thing is, once you invent it, then your troubles have just started, right? Because you have to manufacture it, you have to inventory
right,
it, you have to market it, you have to brand it, you have to distribute it, you have to do all that stuff, or it's just something
right,
cool in your
yeah,
garage. So,
yeah.
did you turn to somebody else to make them eventually? I mean, that's usually what happens,
Well,
right?
well, here's the thing. Nobody, I couldn't get anybody to take it. But the drummers, it was traveling around. Kenny Aronoff called me when he had first joined John Cougar. I think he was with him for 6 months, and all these drummers were calling me, coming into town, and saying, "Hey, I heard about these things. Can I get these?" And they would come out and they'd buy them from me. And I ended up getting a small business loan to do it, but I would have a booth at the trade show. I started back in I think 80 at the Chicago show, and I ran into this guy by the name of Don Lombardi. And Don had gotten half of the patent of the chain drive pedal. So Don came over and heard about it and said, "This is really a great idea. We want to get into making drums." Now, he wasn't making any drums in 1980. He was making half, he had half of the patent of the chain drive pedal, and he really perfected that. And we would share a booth probably up until about 1984. And it was three of us would be in the booth: Gong Bops, DW, and myself. And I remember trying to make headway there. And Don called me once. I was supposed to license. The one thing I should say, Remo saw it and called me and said, "I would like to produce this. Can we work something out?" And he said, "This is a great idea, but now Remo's a drummer." So I flew out to LA, showed it to Remo, and he said, "We'd like to take it and produce it." I said, "Okay." We worked out a deal. About 2 months later, we're supposed to sign the contract, and Remo calls me and says, "We can't do it." And I thought, "What happened?" He said, "Well, there's something else that's come up, and we'll have to put it off for a year or two, but I don't think you want to wait. So, but if I can help you with it and get started, let me know. But I can't do it." So a couple of days later, Don Lombardi calls me. And I tell Don the situation, and Don says, he's got a new thing now called PTS. And he said he thinks that's going to be the future of the drum industry. He says, "In fact, I've got a couple of the heads that he gave me. Do you want to try it?" Because he said, "I think you might be able to put one of these heads on a rims mount, and you'd basically have a drum."
Right.
Okay, so he sends them to me. Tom heads. I put together a 12-inch and a 14-inch, and I take it to a gig as a joke. I have the bass drum, snare drum, and I have the tom, 12-inch and a 14-inch over here, and I'm playing it on this gig, and the guys in the band are laughing like crazy. But the one guy says, "They sound amazing." I said, "Oh." He said, "What's the bass drum one sound like?" I don't know. I'll put one together. I put the bass drum together. That was the beginning of the headset. And I started getting calls for that. Drummers were calling, "Hey, here you've got this little thing that folds up. It weighs like 8 pounds." And I said, "Yeah, but it's not really, I only have a couple of heads." Well, by that time, a fella in town here that had a big company had heard about it. His company was called Minnesota Rubber, at $130 million company. And he said, "By the way, I hear you were over at our facility looking for some grommets or something." I said, "Yeah, I have this drum set." He said, "Sounds really interesting. Is there something we could work out here?" So I said, "Sure." I says, I can't produce this thing." They took it over. They decided to use the PTS heads with the set. And that was the start of the headset. Now, here's another thing, which is interesting. I took it to the first trade show, the headset. Drummers loved it. Stores thought it was a joke. In fact, Sam Ash came up to me at the show and looked at it, and he just laughed. He said, "What makes you think that you can accomplish what nobody, not Flatjacks or anybody, could do?" He said, "Everybody has tried to do this, and nobody's accomplished it." I said, "I use this set. I get calls for this set." I said, "I'll get leaders that'll say, 'Listen, we're doing a small gathering tonight. There's not enough room for a drum set. Bring that little folding thing you set you got.'" So I had that. The drummers at the show were saying, "How soon can we get that?" The dealers are saying, No way. I have no interest in that set whatsoever. That's no drummer's going to buy that." So I started to realize there's a disconnect between the business aspect of what's out there and what drummers really need. So when I started Rims, and anything I come up with, if it doesn't make a difference in my playing, I don't put it out. And I've got 5 other items that have never even seen the light of day, tilting hi-hats and things like that are ergonomically designed. And that's sort of how I look at things. But I started to realize, when you try to sell this to a company or get them to look at it, they don't understand how drummers think. They think in terms of how many of these can I sell? How about if I change the color? Let's go with an exotic wood on this one. And it's just a disaster, you know? So anyway, everything I do is all about sound and convenience.
So how
You
did
know,
you
there
end
was
up?
something I saw on your site, um, and something you said earlier. One was uh, the drummer who came to you and said, "There's too much hardware on these drums."
Yeah,
And on your site, you have an example. You use a club date uh, tom as an example for your rims, which
yeah,
the club date is the was the entry level slash student um, series from Ludwig back in the 60s. As a collector, I have both the classics, which are the have the top and bottom lugs, and the club dates, which have a single lug in the middle. And the fact of the matter, to my ear, the club dates with less hardware have
right,
always sounded better.
right,
And when
right.
I saw the club date, I saw you use the club date as an example on your website.
Yeah.
I wondered if you'd experienced the same thing. Less hardware um, makes for more openness, and then you take the more open drum and apply your technology to it, and
Yeah.
that's as good as it gets.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the sort of the axiom that I go by. People will say, "How do what?" They'll ask me about inventing and designing things, and I said, "You know, inventing is incredibly easy. It's understanding the problem that's hard." And I go back to when my dad had a gas station for 50 years, and both my brother and I worked in it. Gas was 24 cents a gallon. And at one time it was at 19 cents. So the cars back in those days got maybe 7, 8 miles a gallon. When the gas situation started back in the 70s, all of a sudden these cars that had 30-gallon tanks, trying to fill these up when it's up at, now it's up at 98 cents a gallon. It's up at $1 a gallon. What happened? All of a sudden the car company said, "Uh-oh, we gotta make these more fuel efficient." So right then and there, what dictated the design of that vehicle was the dollars and cents. And they figured we got to get weight off of this vehicle cannot weigh 3, 4 thousand pounds. We got to get it down to 1,500 because that will make it more efficient. Same thing with drums. If you want sound, what you're talking about, Steve, is I've got to relate a story at Pure Cushion that was formed for my products by a company called Minnesota Rubber. I was very fortunate to meet a guy there that was in the corporate division, and he had started as a pattern maker, tool die maker, and a machinist. And he came to the first NAM show, and he thought it was funny because he said, "I'm interested, usually used to going to industrial shows." And he said, "You just see a lot of guys walking around buying machinery." You know, he said, I can't believe that this is an amazing show." So we walked around that show all day, and he looked at all the different drum sets. And at the end of the day, we're having dinner, and he said, "Do you guys ever get tired of hauling around a lot of heavy stuff?"
I had a
And
solo company. Yes.
I said, "Yeah, I have a bad back. That's why I designed a headset." I said, "Because I had terrible back problems." He said, he said, "Well, you know what?" He said, "All the hardware, all the lugs are made out of zinc. All your drum lugs are zinc." And I said, "So what does that mean?" He said, "Zinc is heavy." He said, "Now, those lugs could all be made out of aluminum, which is a third of the weight." And I said, "Arnie," his name was Arnie Ryan, by the way. And I said, "Arnie, why don't they do that?" He says, "Well, I can tell you why they don't do it. Because zinc is cheap.
Price. Yeah.
It's about 20 cents a pound." He said aluminum at that time was about $1.40 a pound. He said, "Everything I see on a drum set is made to make it as cheaply as possible, but a chrome plate's great. Zinc chrome plate's wonderful." And he said, "The cosmetics of everything I see at this show, it's all cosmetics, unless you get into pianos and guitars and you get into horns and things like that." He said, "This seems to be the only industry that really, this is what's important." I said, "Yeah, I guess you're right." And he said, "But if you change those materials," he said, "you could lighten that drum set to about half of its weight, maybe knock at least a third of the weight off of the set. And he said, would it sound better? I don't know. You should do that. He said, he helped me develop the headset. And the one thing I always thought was the perfect blend of business to function. He said, you tell me how this set needs to work and what it should sound like, and I'll design the parts to get it there. And that was this. The perfect design. A person says to you, I don't know anything about what you do. You tell me what you need to do it to get it to sound to what you know. And that headset, they were selling $4 or $5 million a year worth of those sets, and now they're collector's items. Sets that originally sold for $400 or $500. There's some of those sets sell for $2,500, $3,000 if you can find them. So that set is still very popular, and but it was a set that I used, and I designed it all with the sound. And it was because of Arnie Ryan that we came up with the exact formula for the rubber, the little holders. That rubber, we experimented for 6 months to get those little holders because not any particular rubber would work, and it choked the hell out of the sound. We finally found a nitrile compound because the company was called Minnesota Rubber. It was the Cadillac of the industry. They knew how to mix rubbers to get to the frequency you needed to isolate. And when they came up with that, that made that drum set sound as great as it did. So and we eventually went to a tunable head rather than the PTS, but that really served its purpose when we started. So, but I hope that answers your question, Steve. I don't know if you have any others.
Yeah, it really does. And Michael, Ron Dennett, we talk about lugs and extra hardware. You might want to share his perception of the 6 lug versus 8 lug versus 10 lug snare.
Well, I got a couple of things to throw out. One is that the weight versus cost. I've been getting into a lot of camping and backpacking, right? So if you want a 2-person tent, it might be 8 pounds. For every pound you take off of that is another $100.
Yeah.
So they have tents that are a pound for these ultralight guys, but they're $800. So there is that. And I'm reminded of Steve had some advice for me once, which was never sell anything with a barcode. he likes intellectual property. You don't have these problems with intellectual property. And then to your point, Steve. Ron Dennett. Ron and I, at the Chicago show one year, Stanton Moore and Ron Dennett were having this discussion. Ron was going to make this Spirit of New Orleans snare drum, and as a drummer, I never paid any attention to what kind of lugs it was there were on there, and how the flanges and the rims and I realized that that's a big deal to a lot of people, and the question came up, well, should a snare drum have 8 and 10? How many lugs do you put on a snare drum? And Ron was like, well, you don't need that many. I mean, if 10 is better than 8, then 12 is better than 10, and 16 is better than 12, then 20 is better than 16. I mean, that logic doesn't follow through.
Well, I've got something here quick to show you because this is the last thing that I've been working on, and let me grab it. What you see here is a die-cast hoop, right?
Okay.
This hoop, the mold for this hoop is probably $60,000. Now, the problem with die casting, and I learned this from this Arnie Ryan, he knew all of the different processes, and he filled me in on how that works. He said the problem with die casting is when you die cast a hoop like this, if it cools too fast, it will potato chip. You'll get a hoop that it's difficult to work. You can't get it tuned right. And he said to make the slightest change on here, you got to change the mold. That's probably a $3,000 cost. Now, this weighs 1 pound, 9 ounces. Okay. Now, I want to show you this. You see this here? This was made on a CNC machine from a solid piece of aluminum. This weighs 8 ounces. And it was within thousandths of an inch. So when it fits down over the drum head, it fits absolutely perfect. I had 12 of these made. This is for a 10 lug snare drum, and you can also change the design of it within a few seconds. They can change the program on the CNC, go in there, change the profile of it, change the thickness of it. So they can make one, as this company did, gave me this and said, what do you think? And I would say, can you make it a little bit thicker over here by about 10,000? Okay. He goes in, changes the figure. Okay. He says to the shop, run another one. And they run that one. And now we have a different one.
Wow.
So you can make changes so fast, which you could never do with a die cast hoop. And this does not always come out fitting as tightly on the drum head. So this is sometimes why you have problems getting the drum in tune. I made 12 of these for a drum set I've got, and it took the weight off by about 5 pounds, 4 or 5 pounds on this drum set.
Is that
so
patentable?
This, well, it probably isn't. But now the design patent could be. This was the first one I had made, and I think it was probably around $300, $400. They have to write the program. But once they write the program, they just set the machine up, and it doesn't even require anybody to run the machine. It basically just picks the parts up, goes over there, cuts it. This was probably made in about 3 or 4 minutes.
Wow.
Now, if I ordered 20 of these, the price would probably be maybe a fourth or a fifth of what it was, but you can change the design. This one in particular has, what I wanted to do was blend the design of a stamped hoop with a die casting type of facility, but also that it is dead accurate. So when it fits on the table here, there's no potato chip, because when it's made, there's no heat. So you can change it within a few seconds to any design you want. It just depends on the cost of the material. Now, I've, again, used aluminum. I'm not going to use a heavy material because I think aluminum works best. Just like Steve found out that the hardware, the less hardware and the lighter the hardware, the more sound you're going to get out of the drum. Because it's like moving that car years ago that was 3,000 pounds. If you want to get more efficiency out of it, and use less power, get the weight off of it. A drum is the same way. If you've got super heavy lugs on there out of zinc and you hit it, to get that shell moving and vibrating is going to take a lot of energy. I have a set here that I made all the hardware on with the exception of the hoops. And it just sounds wonderful, and it's very open, very deep, and the drums are all much smaller sizes than you normally see. And when anybody plays it, they say, God, the 10-inch sounds like it's a 13. So you can get a much deeper sound, a better sound out of it. So I wouldn't want any hardware like is on the drums today. The hardware that they use, and like Craviotto has always been, I think, one of the best drums made, because John was a stickler for sound, and all his hardware on there is made out of, I think, either brass or aluminum. So he knew that he designed for sound, so that's why his drums sound as great as they do. So
they do. Yeah. Well, I have a question.
Interesting. And it would seem as if you wanted to do runs of a few hundred exceptional kits,
yeah,
the upfront capital investment to get into that kind of business would be a very small fraction.
Oh, it's cheap.
Yeah. And so if you have the right idea and you have an audience who is less price sensitive, so that you can charge what you need to charge for the drums, and control distribution and supply so that the price stays up, there's a real opportunity for a creative manufacturing artist to really put together something very, very exceptional.
Well, here's, the thing about this is, and this only happened within about the last 7 or 8 years, I have a lot of stamp tooling that I did for the rims. I wouldn't do stamping on any of this anymore. It would be laser cutting. But the front end costs, and one of the frequencies, or one of the statements that they used to make is front loading a product. And when you front load a product, you're investing a lot of money. Like if I wanted to make this mold today, it would probably be 60, maybe 70,000. Because John Craviotto told me when he started Solid Percussion, they had a mold made here in Minneapolis, and he said it was 50,000. Now that was back in the early 90s. The upfront cost with this to make one of them, $600.
Yeah, it's amazing.
if I made 50 of these, I could probably get it down to maybe $75 each, depending on the cost of the aluminum. But the thing is, if you start making it out of cheaper material, now you're sort of you're fudging a little bit there. Maybe you could say a lesser line. I'll make them out of a cheaper material, but aircraft aluminum, it just machines nicely, and it's. I think it sounds better. You can anodize it, and when I came out with the new rims, the alloy rims, the guy over there, that the physics department, he said, if you make these out of aluminum, don't chrome plate it. You're going to be right back where you were before. You're going to harden the material. It's going to have a pitch, and it's going to conflict with the pitch of the drum, and you're going to get like a phase cancellation where it's going to choke out. So
Fascinating.
Very fascinating.
yeah,
It is.
So,
It does strike me is that in a world of big corporate manufacturing and specialty manufacturing, the specialty guys, to a great degree, are at the mercy because of the cost. Not how capital intensive it is to start up with
yeah,
proprietary hardware. They
right.
tend to be at the mercy of the hardware manufacturers to some degree. Um, to put those folks in a position where they can truly make a proprietary product, differentiate it from the large corporate manufactured product, um,
Yeah,
let me
come in
touch
because
on
go right
touch on
ahead.
one other thing here. Let's say, I mean, price is a factor. Let's say you got those rims for $50 a piece, and somebody wanted
yeah,
to do two of them on a drum. The retail is going to be $100. That's $200 you're adding to change the rims on one drum, and you might have
right.
six of them.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure it's worth the money in terms of sound, but is it marketable? Is it viable at that level that somebody's going to come and buy it? And would you put it in a store if you were making these, or would you just sell them direct and keep the price a little lower?
Well, a lot of the stuff that I make, the feedback that I get on it, it's drummers that buy it know they're going to use it on other sets and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
there isn't a planned obsolescence in it, which sometimes bothers companies. How can we keep selling more of these? And one of the things I noticed that when I first started playing, there wasn't a drum that wasn't made out of maple,
Right.
and now you have birch and just I'll tell you, I get a lot of calls from drum techs that are working for tours. We just send stuff out for the Jonas Brothers tours, so I'm in connection with that drum tech. But I had a drum tech call me, and his name and who he was teching for will not be revealed. But this gentleman called me a big tour of a very well known person, and he said, "I'm calling you." Because I want to know if I can get some extra long floor tom legs, which we were selling at that time. And he said, I need him for this tour. I'm with so and so. And he mentioned the drummer. And I said, I have some more of these coming in, but, I'll call you when they're available. And I said, by the way, who's who was the drummer again playing? He mentioned the drummer. And he said, yeah, he's a big endorsee for, and he mentions the company. And I said, "Oh," I said, "Is he's been endorsing for that company?" Yeah, and he said they supplied us with one of these exotic wood sets, the Binga. And I said, "Oh," he said, "Absolutely gorgeous set, beautiful set. The only problem is it doesn't sound very good." And I sort of laughed, and he said, "If I thought your rims would solve it, I would have gotten those too." But he said, nothing works. We hold it up, and he said, we have been pulling our hair out trying every drum head combination. I said, well, what's wrong with it? He said, it is so high pitched, even the lowest drum, we can't get any bottom out of it. And he said, why do they use these woods?
It's too
He said
heavy.
he had a standard set, and he said that sounded great. It was a middle of the line set. I don't know what the shells were, but he said we were happy with that set. But he's got to use this set for this tour. And he said it's just doesn't sound very good. And he said I can't understand why they do this. And I said, well, I understand why they do it. They need to sell drums, and drummers buy furniture. That they don't buy an instrument; they buy something that look how great that looks. And then what are the letters on the front head? If it says Slingerland or it says Rogers or whatever is on there, that's what sells their drums. So they're not necessarily sound conscious, and they're not people that are drummers.
And there is a point there to be made about endorsements, where if you're an endorser for X drum company, they don't want you to put your rims on there or your new kind of
Yeah,
the old rims, the mounting system, or the actual rim, or anybody else's third party anything. They're against it,
yeah.
and
Well,
that's part of the business cycle.
both Jeff Porcaro and Larry London, who was a great drummers. And I
Yeah, sure.
remember Larry London had heard about it before I had it out, and I made some in the garage for him, and sent them to him. And he was a real strong supporter. And he called me probably about 4 years later, and he said, "Gary, I wanted you to know I'm going with Yamaha." And he said, "They just did a big full page ad on me." And he said, "They asked me to take the rims off the
Yeah.
drums." And he said, I do 30 or 40 clinics every year, and I refuse to do it. Because he said, if I tell drummers at a clinic that I use your product, and they'll say, well, why aren't they on this set? He said, I can't do that. And Jeff Porcaro did the same thing. Jeff said they asked him to take them off his when he was with Pearl. And he said, I'm not going to do that. Because he said, I never heard the drums sound like what I heard in my head until I put your rims on it. And he said, I won't play a set without them. And he said, I said, but you use them on Pearl drums. He said, no, I only use those on tour. I don't use them in the studio. I use old Gretsch round badge sets or old Gretsch
Yeah.
drums. So, that was a thing where you're trying to balance out. Now, not all endorsees can do that.
Right.
And there's a couple that use my product. I don't want to point them out, but they use them, and I know they're big endorsees for a certain company, and I don't want to give them a hard time and have the company say, "Well, we understand that you're not supposed to be using it," because I know they sign agreements, and those agreements are that they will not use anything that is not made by that company. So
Yeah, but then there's backline issues and people not touring with their own stuff. And I used to get
right,
photographs all the time of artists, and it'd be a wonderful photograph, and I'd tell the guy, "That's a great shot, but I can't use it. That's backline gear.
yeah, yeah,
It's not my
that's
stuff."
right. Yeah, Backline, they do a lot of rental stuff. Yeah,
Yeah. So let
yeah,
me ask you another question. This comes. It seems to be two different directions. You have increasing sustain and get a beautiful big
yeah,
round tone. And there's an industry of you and others that are developing things that make that just expand. And then they also have an industry of people who are creating things to muffle drums. You have the zero
right.
rings. You have the
Oh,
muff. What do you call them? Moon gel. There's all kinds of stuff like that, and they
okay,
seem to be
Michael, I
going
got
in
to
two different directions. So straighten me out.
I got to tell you about around 1981, a guy calls me up and he says, "Hey, I was in a drum shop yesterday, and somebody told me you're making something that makes the drum ring a lot or something." I said, "No." I said, who told you that?" He says, "Well, the guy said that you put this on, the drum rings a lot." I said, "No, the drum resonates." And he says, "Well, I don't know, ring, resonate. You call it one thing, I call it another." And he says, "Why would you do this?" And I said, "Well, haven't you ever?" He says, "Oh," he says, "I make a product that gets rid of the ring." And I said, "What's that?" He says, "It's called dead ringers."
Yeah.
Now, I saw dead ringers, and you stuck them on the underside of the drum, and the drum went thunk.
I remember those.
Basically, all you heard was attack. And I said to him, he says, I said, "Why did you do that?" And he says, "Well, I got tired of drummers complaining about the ring." I said, "Here's the problem with the ring." I said, "The ring is a high pitched frequency. The low frequency disappears right away because it needs the support of the shell." And I said, once you open the drum up, the ring is still there. You just don't hear it because the predominant lower frequency or the fundamental is going to be present. And I said, that's what I designed. And I said, haven't you ever noticed it when you take the drum off and he stops me and he says, okay, I got to stop you right there. Okay, here comes the line, Michael. I'm not a drummer. I don't know anything about drums. I'm a guitar player. So I have a friend in town who wants me to make a small bass. He says, could you invent a bass? I said, look, I don't know anything about a bass. I'm not getting into that because I've seen too many people that design products for percussion that are guitar players and they don't know what they're doing. And so I said, I design strictly for what I know and what I understand. And that's why I thought when you're talking about these different things, they drastically change the sound of the drum. You know, it's like taking a towel and lay it on the top strings of a piano and say, you can still hear the notes, you know, you can hear the pitches, but you really want that sound unless it's a special effect, you know?
Well, like a lawyer, I try not to ask questions I don't already know the answer to. But to your point there, I was hoping you'd have a great answer like that. I knew you would. But there's a difference between ring and sustain. There's a difference between a big sound and volume, right?
Exactly.
You can have a huge sound on the kit and just have it pianissimo. But the characteristic, you know, of the sound itself, the timbre of it, is what you're addressing, and you answered my question.
One of the things that had to drive you crazy, Gary, is that the sound reinforcement business, again, no drummers,
right?
You know, playing in bands over the years, you show up and you have provided sound systems, and these guys can't wait to clamp microphones
exactly
on your, and they clamp them, and I go in and say, guys, you know, I love you, and I appreciate the hard work, but you know, you just killed my drums. You know, would you? They look at me like I'm from Mars because nobody else has suggested they kill their drums. And I say, please just put something on a stand and just put it over it, something simple. Give me a Ed Sullivan setup. Just put me a overhead and a kick or something. But please take those off because it is amazing how badly those clip-on mics can make a kit sound.
Oh yeah, and I got to tell you, when I lived up in Toronto, I was working with a great vibus band with Peter Appleyard, and he was working with Benny Goodman at the time, and he said, "I'm putting together a band to do down at Ontario Place because they want some big names." So he got Bobby Hackett, Zoot Sims, Irby Green, Hank Jones, and he said, "I'm thinking of getting Mel Lewis. What do you think?" Well, Mel has been one of my favorite players, and I said, "Oh, please call Mel." So he got Mel Lewis and he said, could Mel use your drums? I said, absolutely. So I took my drums into the session a couple of weeks later. And Mel says, he said, that's the exact same kit I use at the Vanguard, Gretsch drums. And he said, the engineer came out with all these microphones. I'll put an SM something on the snare drum. I'm going to put an overhead, and then I want one on the bass drum. And Mel says, okay, I want you to take those microphones and put them over in the corner. He said, well, I really want to get the best drum sound. And he says, you'll get a good drum sound. Let me handle it. So Mel says to me, I'm going to show you how to tune a bass drum for a big band. He takes the bass drum, he takes the front head off, takes the felt strip out. Now, this is a 20-inch Gretsch drum. Leaves the felt strip on the back, puts the front head on it. He says to me, Gary, hit an F on the piano. So he tunes the front head down to about an F, and he sets it up. And the guy comes out and puts the mic right in front of it. And when he walks away, Mel, and the guy says, Mel, can we take that front head off? Mel says, no. I mean, when the guy says, okay, you know. So he takes the microphone, and Mel moves it about 2 feet to the right of the bass drum. The guy's got a couple other mics. Mel takes them, sets them over on the side, and he takes one overhead, and he puts it up over the drums. And he says, this is what I've used on all the stuff we did out in L.A. with the Terry Gibbs band. And he sits down, he hits the bass drum, and he's got a cork beater. And when he hits it, the drum, I'm sitting behind him, and the drum just rings, I should say resonates like crazy. But I'm hearing this sound, and I thought the engineer is gonna have a fit, And he tuned left the toms pretty much where they were, and tells me normally when I record, I use a calf head on the snare drum. I don't like to record, but he said this sounds good. This is good. This is a pretty new head. I'm sitting behind him, and when he hits the bass drum, I almost cringe because I think when this is played back, it's going to be ringing like crazy. And that night, I sat behind Mel for about 3 hours, 3.5, 4 hours. I've never seen a worse technique in my life. He played, his hands were up like this, that you could see the palms of his hands when he was playing. When I heard it played back, I've never heard such beautiful playing in my life. And the drums just sounded exquisite. You could feel the drum almost more than you could hear it. And his playing, he had that old funky cymbal that had two big chunks out of it
Hmm.
that he used with the Terry Gibbs band and the Jerry Mulligan band. Because he told me, he says, I used this one, everything I did with Terry and Jerry Mulligan. He says, Buddy Rich offered me $1,000 for this cymbal and any cymbal in his house. And he said, if you've ever been to Buddy's house, he's got cymbals going up the steps. There's cymbals. He must have at any one time 100 and some cymbals in his house. But he wanted this one cymbal. And it looked god awful. He found it on a junk pile behind the music store in Buffalo, New York, he told me. So that cymbal was very well known, and it just sounded wonderful when he played it. But his playing, I learned so much by just watching him and listening to him on his ideas of what a great drum sound was, that probably affected me. He and Shelly Manne probably affected me more about my outlook and what drums were really all about than anything. So they were really quite amazing. And I wrote a letter to Shelly after I came out with Rims, and he sent me a beautiful letter back, just just saying, I'm really glad I could help you with that. What a great idea. And I think he passed away shortly after that. So anyway,
Well, those
but
are
that's
two of my
my
big
lowest
heroes right there.
story. Yeah,
Mel and
yeah,
Shelley.
What a
Yeah,
great story.
that's me. And
yeah.
great stories. All of them are great stories. Well, we're coming up to an hour. That's about as long as we should go on this, and I sure appreciate you, Gary. We could do another one sometime if that's okay. I haven't gotten your website and all your
I'd
news
like
yet.
to. I'd like to, as a
Go ahead.
dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, I'd like to insert a little commercial. When I looked on your site, it looked to me as if folks want to be able, due to supply chain and all the things that are going on today, there's a limited supply of some of your best designs that are available on your site in the rims category. Is that correct?
Yeah. But I should also tell you one of the reasons that the supply chain issues came up with COVID. And I had patented another system, which actually I wanted to put out instead of the one I have now. So, what I had intended to do 3 years ago was discontinue this version of rims and come out with a more compact design rims that could possibly, the suspension could be possibly built into the drum head. So that's really one of the reasons I didn't want to continue with this. So, but COVID sort of made the decision for me. So,
Well, I would just say, folks like me who want to go in, I've always been a big believer in these suspension mounts. And Gary, I'm embarrassed to say that I have these that are inspired, hopefully licensed from a variety of vendors. And the places that I shopped, uh, I wasn't able to access your product. So one of my projects is going to be to go through and get myself a set of your designs and apply them to one of my most cherished kits, and uh, and look forward to the sonic results that I get. I look forward to that, and am very appreciative of what you've done for the sound of the drum and for the musicality of what we try to do.
great. Well, I
Absolutely.
appreciate it. See, let me know. You send me an email and let me know what you need there. I'll see if what we got in stock. We don't have a lot of stuff in stock, but if I can help you out with those, I'd be glad to.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
His name is Gary Gauger. He's a drummer. He's a jazz musician. He's an entrepreneur. He's an inventor. He's a freaking scientist. And one thing I didn't mention, I'll say for on the way out here, is people have looked at the development of the drum set, and looked at the bass drum pedal, right? Had to have that.
Right.
The plastic head, which enabled millions of people to play drums that maybe wouldn't have. And the other thing
Right.
they always cite for the advancement, true advancement of drum design, is rims.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you've earned that place in the history of drums. Congratulations. It's not
Thank
easy
you.
to do. Anything else, gentlemen?
Well, I miss seeing you at the trade shows, Michael. I haven't been to them in a while. Have you gone to any of them?
No, Steve and I used to go after I sold my company, but now COVID kind of killed it, and then the whole industry's changing
Yeah.
so much. I don't know what's going to happen. NAMM is struggling.
Yeah.
I'm thinking I'm going to go to the Nashville show because it's right up the street for me. My son just moved there. That's in a couple of
Oh,
months.
okay. Okay.
But
Well, maybe I'll see you in Minneapolis sometime,
I
huh?
hope so, man. I've never been to Minneapolis.
Oh, it's beautiful, especially in the summertime. Wintertime, it's a little desolate. So,
I like winter. I like it up there. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you. I think there was an issue with this broadcasting live, but if there is, I'll just repost it. I'll record it here, and I'll send you some links of where it's up. It goes on YouTube, and it goes on Facebook to a bunch of places, and it goes to anywhere where fine podcasts are available. And if you believe in a God, we'll get 10 or 12 hits. I'm just kidding. All right, I'm going to throw some. I never got to a spot. Let me do a spot on the way out, and I'll take it through the credits. Steve Bryant and Gary Gauger, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on Drummer Nation Live.
thanks, Steve. Thanks, Michael.
Hey, it's a pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Stan Kiawa, and welcome to the Professional Drum Shop. 1959 it opened up. Here we have Buddy Rich's, the last set he ever played. Last gig he played with Mel Torme at the Palladium. I set it up for him. One of the most iconic pictures is this one. Joe Morello Clinic around 1963. Mr. Hal Blaine, good friends of the store for decades.
The stories that go on, I mean, if these walls could talk, holy mackerel, we'd all go to jail.
Drummers seeking a quick and easy way to muffle bass drums on the fly, look no further. Muffbone offers an effective way to instantly dial in your sound in just a few seconds while seated at the kit. Find out more at muffbone.com.